Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University here to help you pass your NASM exam. And today we're going to talk about on this video, we're in chapter 9, and I'm going to continue kind of talking through the 3 macronutrients. So in 2 previous videos, we talked about proteins, carbohydrates, or at least what NASM wants you to know about those macros. And now we're going to talk about fats, or what we actually call lipids. Just keep in mind the term lipid is actually the proper term that we use. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the digital copy. So, let's go ahead and talk about lipids, structure of lipids. Technically, fats are just a type or a subgroup in the broad general lipid category. As always, keep in mind, NASM gives you terms on the sidebar here. And by the way, if you're using your hardcover, hardbound textbook, that's great. Just so you do know, if you have both, that's great. You can obviously toggle back and forth. I like to use the digital just because it's easier to show you things, but it's also easier on the digital because then I can navigate through. If I need to find something quickly, I can search through it that way. On the other hand, I do like to use the hardcover or hardbound textbook as well when I'm studying, because it's just easier for me. Just visually, that's what I'm used to doing, is reading from a textbook and then rewriting, so I can go back and forth. And that's my recommendation. Read it, rewrite it, say it out loud. That's going to help you to memorize the material. Keep in mind, chapter 9 here with nutrition is not a high priority chapter, kind of a moderate. They are going to ask you a bunch of questions from it, just so you know. And probably not going to get 20 questions, but I wouldn't be surprised if just from this chapter alone, you get 5, maybe even more questions on your exam. So it's a good idea to know this information. So I read it, rewrite it. I use again, NASM has given you these sidebar. These are the things you need to practice, study, and know and memorize. Now, whether or not you want to actually memorize table 913, I always kind of back up, because students do ask me, so how am I going to use this when I actually get my certification and I'm training people? So I think that's important that you do understand. You kind of go back and forth on this. Here's what we want you to do. Pass the test. Get through the test. If you don't agree with some of the methodology, if you don't agree with some of this, I don't know why you wouldn't. But the point is, if you don't, it doesn't matter. Pass their exam, and then you can move on to doing the actual real world training. The information in chapter 9 is a good idea to know this. It's very helpful. Nutrition is the single most important component that helps people change their bodies, not just the way they look, but how they feel. Nutrition is key. So it's a good idea to get a rough overview of this information. Then you can, of course, study at a deeper level. So I'll kind of go back and forth with you specifically on fats, because lipids are very interesting, especially when it comes to human nutrition. Definitely not well understood by the layman or even the average trainer. And there's a lot of information that's coming out now that not necessarily contradicts, but is not really on the same level of understanding as information that we used to govern ourselves by 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Remember, saturated fats were bad. Well, no, actually, they're not bad necessarily. No one nutrient is going to be the downfall of your body physiologically. So saturated fats are critically important. It's the amount that you consume, along with the other 50 variables, 50 factors or more that go into your overall health, particularly cardiovascular. So a lot of information, and that's why I want to go over a little bit more in depth here with you when it comes to lipids, because some folks are just like, I don't want to eat any fat. Fat is bad. Well, that's a huge problem, because there are many physiological functions in your body that require the consumption of lipids in your diet. Again, it's just, don't be eating 2 sticks of butter to get your saturated fats for the day. We also know that's not correct. So when you're going through this particular area, and generally a sub unit area like this, the lipids inside of chapter 9, probably take you about 30 minutes or so to run through this one area. And what I'm doing is I'm just kind of showing you what I recommend you do from a studying perspective. So I look at those definitions, and I go lipids, and I write those lipids, group of fats, fatty acids, and their derivatives, includes triglycerides, phospholipids, and I write that down. And if I write it down a couple of times, after a while, I'm actually going to memorize it. I won't even have to look at it anymore. I'll already know what lipids are. It's a subclass or a grouping of different fats, triglycerides, right? And I'll be able to do that if I read it and rewrite it. Like I was saying, table 913 just gives you a sort of a compressed, condensed version of really important information. So the type of lipid, triglycerides, which generally is what we talk about for the most part in human nutrition when we're, where the rubber meets the road, because we get our blood work done and we look at both cholesterol, HDL, LDLs, but we also look at triglycerides. Very, very important. Remember, the storage form of fat, all this stuff underneath, that's in the form of triglycerides. That's how the body stores fat, triacylglycerol. So glycerol backbone, and I'm just showing you here the description. It's glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acid chains. Okay, so it's a good idea. And we're going to show it on the next page. What does that actually mean? So you have this glycerol group is what we normally say with 3 fatty acid chains, hence the term tri, 1, 2, 3, and a fatty acid. I'm going to show you here in a second. On the next page, helps us to understand exactly what a triglyceride is. Now, remember, the triglyceride is a glycerol backbone. So glycerol, by the way, just real quick, let me just show you real quick. So there's no, and again, I'm showing you this because there's generally confusion, especially with students that are just studying nutrition. If you've ever heard of glycerol, it's a clear, pretty much odorless liquid. That's what glycerol is, right? They use it, if I remember correctly, like in bomb making. But glycerol has a chemical structure. It's got three carbons. It's got 8 hydrogens, and I think it's got 3 oxygens. So C3H8O3. Remember your chemistry in high school? Remember, you probably fell asleep through this. But that's glycerol. And basically glycerol can, under the right conditions, have 3 what we call fatty acids, free fatty acids, or fatty acids, right? So fatty acids are a whole nother chemical structure, right? These things kind of, what if they're floating around, 3 of them can attach to this glycerol, and then we call it a tri, 3 fatty acid chains. They're just carbon chains. Those 3 fatty acids can connect to this, and we have what's known as and I just drew a box, but it's called a glycerol backbone. Okay, don't want to get too much into the chemistry. It's just not even necessary, but it's really, really cool. Fats are really, really interesting because they have many different interesting properties, all because of, well, in this case, all because of the structure of these fatty acids, right? That make the fats that they're contained in either solid or room temperature, temperature dependent, by the way, liquid, right? So these are all very, very interesting. Let me clear this. And so the idea is that if you want, you can go ahead and, just as a for instance, look at these descriptions and food sources. Of course, very interesting stuff. It's not a bad idea to know these things, not just from a testing perspective, because they could ask you a question from this table in particular, but for your real world understanding of foods and why they are the way they are, why you shouldn't eat certain things, why certain things are good for you, this can be very helpful. So that's that page. Next page, here's again, how deep do you want to get into the biochemistry of this? This is a fatty acid. Now, remember, we had glycerol over here, right? So we have glycerol. Let me go ahead. Let me write this down for you. So you have glycerol, right, which was the C3, right? So you have C3, right? You have hydrogen, and I'm just kind of drawing stuff for you. So you got hydrogen, and this, here are your hydrogens, and you got your oxygens, and I'm not going to draw the whole thing, but this glycerol, remember the C3H8O3, this forms what we call the glycerol backbone. This is a single fatty acid. These fatty, and they're real quick. This guy over here is called the omega end. Omega end. You can't read that. And this is called the alpha end, right? So just so you know, it's pretty basic stuff. So omega end, right? Alpha and omega, right? Beginning and the end, right? So this is the beginning, or that side that connects to the, just basically connects biochemically to the glycerol group. And if you got 3 of those, you have what's known as a tri 1, 2, 3 glyceride. Kind of cool, kind of interesting stuff. When you want to get deep into the biochemistry, anytime you have a double bond between the carbons, okay, you have you move from a saturated fatty acid into an unsaturated fatty acid. If there's a single double bond that kinks that molecule, you have a mono unsaturated fatty acid. 2 or more kinks, because you can have multiple kinks or multiple double bonds. You have what are known as poly unsaturated fatty acids. You can get very confusing because people confuse the term fatty acid with a saturated fatty acid with a saturated fat. They're not the same thing, folks. I know it's confusing. It just so happens that the terminology is chemical terminology, chemistry, and this is the standard way it's explained in chemistry. And then there's nutrition and food. So butter, what is butter? Saturated fat, right? Well, no, not really. Butter itself, that's that yummy stuff that you eat, contains saturated fatty acids and unsaturated fatty acids. Pretty much every natural fat that you have out there. Now we call olive oil, don't we call olive oil a mono unsaturated fat? Well, yeah, but that's only because the dominant, or the majority of free fatty acids inside of olive oil are oleic acid, which is a mono unsaturated fatty acid. But olive oil, that liquid stuff that you pour onto your salad and stuff, it actually contains saturated fatty acids. But I think it's like 5% of all the saturated fatty acids inside of olive oil are saturated, something like that. I don't remember the actual number, but 65% of all the fatty acids, all of these guys found in olive oil, is oleic acid, which is a mono unsaturated fat. So don't want to get too much into it, but one thing that is of interest is what we call omega 3s, omega 6s. And of course, those are the interesting, right? Those are the interesting things we talk about, especially with our clients. You're supposed to consume fish oils and omega 3 fatty acids. And all we talk about when it comes to omega anything is where the actual kink occurs along the chain of your carbons. That's all it is. And you start at the omega end, or what's known as the methyl end, which is over here, CH3. That's that end. So we call this the omega. Omega is a really cool word too. So omega. So omega 1, 2, 3. So the omega carbon is the 3rd carbon along that chain. If the kink occurs between the 3rd and the 4th carbon, boop, like you see here, like you see there, it's called an omega 3. If the first kink occurs between the 6th and the 7th carbon in the chain, we call that an omega 6. There's omega 9s and omega 12s, omega 15s, because some of these free fatty acids can have up to 22, 23 carbon chains long. And so you can have kinks in the 3rd, the 6th, the 9th, and the 12th one. Okay, you can have kinks all along. You can have 3 double bonded carbons in certain saturated fatty acids, 5, 6. You can have multiple double carbon. Those are what we call polyunsaturated fatty acids. Look, if that confused you, then for sure, let me know in the comments section. I don't want to confuse you, but the point is that fats can be fairly complicated. The nature of how we interact with them, right, is determined to a great extent by what I just showed you here. So it's all very interesting stuff. And when a natural occurring fat contains predominantly saturated fatty acids in its chemical structure, in its triacylglycerol structure, then it's probably going to be solid at room temperature. This is one of the reasons where the flavor of the month is coconut oil, right? Well, coconut oil contains saturated fatty acids along with mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids. The dominating fatty acids in coconut oil are saturated. It doesn't make it unhealthy, ladies and gentlemen. Just keep that in mind as you go through this. So the other thing is that particularly in this section are, again, some interesting facts that it's not a bad idea to look and read. So stretch your knowledge. Box has some very, very interesting information. It basically says that don't be looking at the information from the 1950s and the 1960s about how bad saturated fats are. Because the fact of the matter is that we've learned a lot in the past 50, 60 years, a whole lot about what the true causes of heart disease and cardiovascular illness are. It's not that saturated. Please don't go out and eat a stick of butter. I'm not saying that either. But what we are saying is that don't not eat butter. Why are you not eating butter? Why? Because saturated fats are bad? No, they're not bad. In fact, some of them are actually necessary. There are 2 essential fatty acids, linoleic acid and alpha linolenic acid. So those 2 essential fats, your body can't produce. You need to consume those in your diet. The question is simply how much, okay? So don't want to beat the dead horse. NASM wants you to kind of keep in mind that this table 914 is probably an important table to understand. So this idea that monounsaturated fats, and if I was going to rewrite the table, that's what I would do. I'm literally doing it for you right here. I would write type of fat mono. To keep in mind also, you don't have to rewrite literally word for word, but I'll be honest with you. They gave you bullet points. You can't go wrong with a bullet point when it comes to rewriting it. Okay. I'm always trying, I will tell students all the time, try to compress. If you can figure out a way for your brain to compress the verbiage that's being used, then do it. I don't know how you do that with this. They've got as conservative as they could with the amount of words that they use. So I would simply rewrite this as well. Ultimately, your goal is to memorize as much as you can. I'm not saying that you memorize this entire chart, but some of this stuff, like I'll give you a great example. You don't have to necessarily memorize this word, icosapentaenoic acid, docosa or docosa hexanoic acid. Okay, I can't even pronounce it. Alpha linolenic acid. Okay, don't just write EPA, DHA. Everybody knows what you're talking about. So more than likely on a test, if they were to ask you that, and by the way, these are the two guys right here that are notable within fish oils. Okay, so this is, and by the way, if you take fish oils, these are the things, this is what you're looking for, total milligrams. You want, a pretty decent amount. Your brain uses a lot of this stuff. So these are critical fatty acids that you need to get in your diet. Okay, so, and then you've got your omega-6s and saturated fats, and of course, trans fats. These are no-goes. You don't want to consume trans fats whatsoever in your diet. Whatever you get from nature, it's so low, it's so minimal, it's almost negligent. Okay, so anytime you see food that contains trans fat, then they're not going to say that anymore, just so y'all know. They're not going to say, because everybody knows, manufacturers know this stuff is poison. You don't want it in your diet at all. That's one of the things I will always tell clients is just stay away from processed. By the way, stay away from processed oils as well, as much as you can. So, but that's another video all on its own. Okay, so moving on, key things to remember here. This is just interesting information, by the way, in the stretch your knowledge. Again, this is not a, it's not a long sub part of the chapter, subheading, subunit of the chapter. So go ahead and read it. Again, this is interesting information, right? It tells us one of the main reasons why we have cardiovascular disease in our country in particular is the overconsumption of omega-6 fatty acids. Vegetable oil is not good for you, okay? Don't go to the store and buy vegetable oil. Stay away from processed as much as you can. The only processed oils that I ever truly recommend are going to be either coconut oil, maybe olive oils, things like that. But the overly processed vegetable oils, try to stay away from as much as I can. They're polyunsaturated fats, and they, unless it's an omega-3 from fish oils, I try to stay away from it. I tell my clients to do the same thing. Over on the right side, of course, you've got these definitions: pancreatic enzymes, lingual lipase, generally from a digestive perspective. I'm not really interested, for the most part, in going over too much of the where it occurs. We know that for the most part, fat digestion, and I'll open this up for you. Fat digestion, yes, there's a little bit, but I don't get caught up with stuff happening in the mouth with fat. That's the predominant area of digestion for carbohydrates, is in the mouth. Fat, the predominant digestive area for fats, is going to be in the small intestines. Now, does a little bit of enzymatic activity occur in the mouth? Yeah, a tiny bit, but again, it's just not that much. Little to no activity occurs in the stomach for fat digestion. Remember, the stomach's main digestive operations are on proteins, right? It's at least a little bit. And then, by the way, there are some enzymes in the stomach that help to continue this emulsification process and breakdown of fats. But ultimately, it's in the small intestines. As soon as the food that you have eaten goes into the stomach and moves into what's known as the duodenum, which is the beginning part of the small intestines, this is where pancreatic and liver-based enzymes are kind of shuttled into the duodenum, and this is where the emulsification process and breakdown of fats into smaller units generally occurs, and then the absorptive process, continued breakdown, by the way, and absorption of lipids occurs. Small intestines, again, you've seen this before, portal vein into the liver. We call it the portal circulation, or hepatic portal. Hepatic means liver. Remember, the liver gets everything first for the most part. In some cases, like with alcohol, it bypasses all of that. Alcohol can actually be absorbed through the stomach, crazy enough. But the thing about fats is that it moves through the lymphatic system before entering the blood system. Very interesting. It's not a bad idea to kind of know this as well from a testing perspective. The understanding is that, and again, just so you know, let me write this for you. Keep in mind that anytime you see sort of these numbers, they're fair play on a test. It's fair play, right? They can ask you, based on the dietary guidelines, U.S. dietary guidelines, the lipid dietary needs would be generally 15 to 25%, 20 to 30%, 35%, 40. There it is. And that's the number. Okay. Even something as simple as the ratio between omega-6 and omega-3s, that's fair game. They could ask you something like that. So great information here about fat and satiety. Fat generally reduces your hunger. It's one of the reasons why it's an important component in your normal food intake. But again, that's not a bad piece of information, not a bad piece of information to know when you're studying. You'd literally write it down, okay, and try to just get an understanding of what the term metabolite is. Now, generally, metabolites are considered to be the byproduct of the breakdown of other substances. In this case, they're using it for its very technical definition, which is the formation of a substance required for metabolism, right? Which then is going to serve physiological processes. And then the last part here for lipids, again, interesting, good information, absolutely nothing wrong with kind of looking at this. I'm not going to necessarily say you need to memorize any of this, but the understanding that cholesterol, HDL, LDL, the deal is that your body produces more cholesterol than you could ever consume in your diet. Some people produce more, some people produce less. So the amount of cholesterol you consume, it's not really that big of an issue, so to speak. And, doctors are generally coming on board with that understanding. And that's what this second stretch your knowledge box is telling you. Again, it's good information. It's information that when all is said and done, you can share with your clients. Now, again, from a testing perspective, remember what we went over. Read it, rewrite it, know those definitions on the sidebar for this particular subunit. And again, 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes to really go through it, write it, rewrite it, and do that over and over until you've got it down pat in your brain. Look, if you have any questions on this particular video, leave it in the comment section below. If you need a little bit more iteration of this information, you want to know a little bit more about it, or you don't understand one of the concepts fully, just let us know. We are more than happy. Share the video as well. You may know people that are actually interested in this, and go ahead and share it with them. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. This way, when the new material is coming out. As always, it's a pleasure to go over the information with you. Remember, we want to help you pass the NASM exam, and just let us know if we can be of any assistance. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week.